We are at chapter 15 of the book of Revelation, and I am kind of a little bit regretful because it seems like at the end here we're taking a little more time going into more detail than we did at the beginning. So I'm kind of thinking at the beginning I didn't want to go into such great detail. I wanted to look at the major events, and but now I find that we are looking at the details of each verse, every line, and so on, and it's giving a different flavor to what we are doing. So I regret we should have started like that, but I didn't really plan to maybe focus on some of the things that I find us focusing on. But I guess it's all for the best. Anyway, we're at chapter 15, and the last thing we looked at was the mark of the beast crisis, which starts in Revelation chapter 13. In chapter 14, you have the three angels flying. I heard Brother Howard say it this morning. I'm going to repeat it. The work of God, the activities of God in the book of Revelation are represented as angels. And that's a broad statement, but I think it's pretty accurate. In Revelation chapters 2 and 3, the messages to the seven churches are addressed to the angel of each church. And so God is not speaking to an angel in the sense that we understand angels. He's speaking to his representatives, or those who stand as his representatives in each of these churches. And we saw that the three angels in Revelation represented God's work through his people on earth, represented as angels. So an angel is really, the literal meaning of the word angel is messenger, from the Greek word angelos. It means messenger. So God has many messengers. Sometimes his messenger is an act of nature. Sometimes his messenger is a human being. Sometimes his messenger is a literal heavenly being. But the main idea behind an angel in Revelation is that it's a message, it's an act of God, it's an activity of God, usually carried out through some agent. So it's represented as an angel. So the three angels of Revelation, and when the three angels flew, we saw that the three messages, in a limited sense, you might say Adventists believe that they have been carrying the message since 1844. But I believe that it was at best in a very limited and secondary way, because the hour of God's judgment had not arrived in 1844, although they say it was a pre-Advent judgment. There might be some merit to that. And then the fall of Babylon, I don't think that happened in 1844, or even shortly thereafter. And the mark of the beast crisis, it has not come yet. When the three angels fly in Revelation 14, it is in the context of a crisis that is already upon the planet. So the message has power, because we're not speaking about some theoretical thing. Right now, you might tell people about well, you have more chance talking about the mark of the beast now because it's on everybody's mind. But most people think that it has to do with probably the vaccine or the microchip or something. You might talk about the fall of Babylon, but even though it's kind of getting more obvious, it's not clearly evident yet, because there are still many sincere Christians who have a question. Should I remain in the church, or is it time to leave? When Babylon is fallen, I don't think that question is going to remain in the mind of every honest person. The fall of Babylon is going to be clearly designated by something that the churches do, something that the churches accept, and it will be the receiving of the mark of the beast. Denominationally, the churches will receive the mark of the beast, or they will cease to exist. It can't be both ways. And the biblical representation suggests that they will continue to survive right down until close to the end of time. So obviously the institutionalized religious bodies will concede and accept the mark of the beast on a whole, while the people of God will get out of these systems. So what we see is that after the three angels' messages, the next thing that happens is that Jesus appears on a cloud with a sickle in his hand. And we see that it is the harvest. The Bible represents the harvest as taking place immediately after the three angels' messages. So the obvious conclusion is that the three angels' messages, the mark of the beast crisis, brings the world to judgment. The world is judged in the sense that everybody on the planet, those who profess to be Christians and those who have no profession at all, the true state of their hearts, of their attitude to God, is to be measured by how they deal with this crisis. This needs to be emphasized over and over. There are many people who are not Christians, but they are what you would call God-fearing. They have respect for God in some kind of way, and they just have never come to the place where they have been compelled to make a choice. And even though God does not compel people, but sometimes you have to be compelled to make a choice, not to choose God, but to make a choice, because you realize you have come to a point in time where it is life or death. And so the decisions that you have put off, the conclusions that you have been reluctant to reach, they face you, and you have to decide it's now or never. So this crisis brings the world to that place, and for some people it is never, and for some people it is now. So the entire planet is brought to judgment by the mark of the beast crisis. This is why I insist about this mark of the beast crisis. There are some things you have to recognize about it. Number one, it has to be an issue that will make everybody fully recognize what the issues are. They have to fully recognize that in rejecting or in accepting, they are rejecting God and choosing the beast. It has to be that clear. It can't be something that is a little uncertain or ambiguous. It can't be something that when you pass through it, somebody is thinking, can this be a really serious issue? Can it be the mark or can it not? If there is room for genuine uncertainty, it cannot be a test. This is why this mark of the beast has to be something that is clear cut, contrary to the revealed will of God, contrary that every honest person can know. As far as God is concerned, this is not the will of God. And yet, the combined authorities of the planet, the combined authorities of the earth, will demand, every authority on the planet will demand that everybody must behave in this way, contrary to the revealed mind of God. It doesn't seem so amazing these days, because these days it becomes increasingly clear that for most people, God is becoming irrelevant. For me, and for every conscious person who is aware of the changes that have been taking place, it is frightening, because I see with my eyes wide open that God is becoming, he's becoming relegated to something like Santa Claus, or the Tooth Fairy, or the Easter Bunny. Many times I find myself going back to the very basics. I ask myself this question, and I ask God the question, what reason would I have for believing that there is no God? Because when you are surrounded by a prevailing spirit, you have to keep asking yourself, am I the crazy one? Can everybody be crazy and I be the person who has a little bit of sense? I have to go back to the basics, and I say, what reason can I have for saying that God does not exist? Or, I mean, I always come back to the simple fundamental. I exist. I exist. You go back to what you can't deny. I exist. There are some people who say that maybe we don't even exist, but none of us is that crazy. Okay, I exist. And if I exist, how did I come to be? When you look at yourself and you consider genetics and microorganisms and planets and worlds and stars and systems, it blows your mind. And this alone is a statement of a magnificent being. Whoever designed this and created it is somebody beyond comprehension. The only question you can have legitimately is, why is God so silent? Why don't I see more of him? That's a legitimate question. But you can't honestly question, is there a God? When you step back and think about it, it's very, very clear. So what I'm saying is, it's strange to me that this mood and this spirit takes over the world where God becomes irrelevant, where nobody respects what God says anymore. I recognize that what people respect these days is, unfortunately, and I look at all the factors that have produced this result. Unfortunately, what people respect is so-called science, scholarship, scholarly education. And I have to say, as I say, unfortunately, the educational system has prepared the world for this. Satan has worked very carefully, very cunningly, and he has developed a system of education where people have learned to depend upon the wisdom of men and exalt the wisdom of men way above the wisdom of God. The Bible is regarded as an outdated, backward book, and where science is lacking, science makes up things. One example is in the arena of the LGBT movement. They searched around with all their might to find a scientific reason, a scientific basis for homosexuality. Nobody has found any genetic reason why people become homosexuals. It doesn't exist. So they would like to be able to find that there's a particular gene, just like there are genes that cause us to be black or white or brown or yellow or red. There are genes that cause us to have the color eyes and the color hair. You can see a person was born like this. They cannot find a genetic reason for homosexuality. They find twins who develop from the same cell. You know how twins are born. You have congenital twins and you have that kind of twins. You have twins who you have two different eggs forming in a woman's womb, two different eggs being conceived at the same time. You have two children born in the mother's womb or conceived in the womb, but they are not the same cell. Two different cells. They come out looking not like each other. And then you have identical twins, which is one particular cell. It splits in two. And when it splits into, it forms into two different children, but it's the same exact genetic material. So the two children are born, they are either two boys or two girls, and they look identical. These are born from the same one cell. And in several cases, one twin has become homosexual and the other one remains straight. And I'm just saying this because I'm emphasizing the point that there is no genetic reason that can be found for a person being gay, despite all the desperate searching they have done. And yet, here's the thing that I find. As a Christian, sometimes I feel so helpless because I see people come on YouTube, they come on the radio, they come on talk shows on the TV, and they say everybody knows that this is something that we are born. People are born this way. How can you be so unkind to speak against it when people are born this way? It's genetic. They keep saying this thing, and it doesn't matter that one or two persons with a little information come on and say it's not genetic. Nobody hears that anymore. Where there's a lack of evidence, propaganda fills the gap. And you feel so helpless because as a Christian, you recognize, where can I get a voice? You get on YouTube. Nobody listens to you. They don't invite you to the talk shows. They don't put you on TV. You don't have the money to get a big satellite station. You just feel like the world lies in the grip of the evil one, and you're just a little blip trying to say something. But it is the way the world is, and it is why the world is ripe for Satan's final takeover. I know that's why I am convicted that the mark of the beast is going to be something that the message itself is not so much that you and I are going to get a megaphone that the world can hear. It's not so much that you and I are going to suddenly multiply by a millionfold, that everywhere we're able to reach people. I think a part of the process is going to be that the mark of the beast issue is going to be so clearly contrary to the will of God that the very fact that it exists is going to make people think. That will be a part of the process of the judgment. Something so clear. It's like, what would you do if they legalized murder? How many people would support it? I suppose you can say that well, they're already legalized abortion, and that's a form of murder. That's true. That's true. The world has really reached a place of craziness because there are so many people who are in support of abortion on demand. Let me put it that way: abortion on demand, killing a child for any reason at all, as long as it's not yet born. So many people are in support of it. There are some things that you think that, like for example, if they were to say, let's legitimize incest, and then again, I suppose people would accept that. Because if you don't believe in God, when evolution has invaded the planet and made a big impact on the world, what what is illegal? What is wrong? How can you determine what is wrong? We had at one point two dogs, a mother and the mother had pups, and one of the pups grew with us, and the dog, when it grew up, it mated with the mother, and my father was a little disturbed when he saw it, and but most of us said it's an animal, it doesn't have any sense, right? The consequences are going to be minimal, so we didn't care. If you think that we all came from evolution, what does something like that matter? If a boy wants to marry his mother, and I know it has happened a couple of times. If you go on the internet and look it up, a couple of people have done that, right? It has happened a couple of times. Yet most well-thinking people who have a fear of God, they're utterly appalled at something like that happen. They're appalled at things like pedophilia and incest and bestiality, because there is a sense of right and wrong that develops in us because we have a concept of God, a God who makes us understand these are my standards. But if there's no God, honestly, if there's no God, what makes something right or wrong? Nothing is right or wrong. The only thing that is right or wrong is what the society chooses to say is right or wrong. Can you see what I'm saying? If my society says it's right for me to um to be married to my sister or to have relations with my sister, eventually it becomes normal because there's no God, and it's just a matter of human ways of thinking. And this explains why the world is so liberal and is becoming so crazy in the things that are happening. It's acceptable for a person. They have now what you call transhumanism, right? You believe you're a cat, or you believe you're a dog, you believe you're a rat. There's a whole society of people that believes they are dogs, and they have masters. They dress up like dogs. Somebody takes them for a walk on a leash. People that would be in a lunatic asylum a few years ago. But the world is changing, because if there's no God, anything is right. And the person who is strange is the person who thinks that there are standards that you live by. So what I'm saying in all of this, I'm really saying, when you think about it really logically, it's not hard to understand why the world is going to embrace the mark of the beast, even though it's something that God outrightly forbids. It's going to be something that God clearly is displeased with, and yet everybody will accept it. And this is why, even though I can see the developing intolerance, the developing totalitarian control that they are imposing because of this COVID thing. And like most people, I believe that it is something that they are taking advantage of to bring the population under the heels of the rulers. But this is why I am pretty certain it's not the mark of the beast, because the mark of the beast has to be something that is completely contrary to the expressed will of God, that they the rulers of the planet impose upon everybody. So it's not the mark of the beast. I'm pretty certain of that. But it's preparing the way, it's paving the way for it. I will agree. Anyway, having said all of that, we come to this afternoon's emphasis. And this afternoon, what we see happening now, because the harvest has taken place, it says that the grapes of the earth were harvested and they were thrown into the great winepress of the wrath of God. This was the last verse we had in Revelation 14. So now we're going to go to chapter 15, where we're going to see a further expansion on this wrath of God. And I'm going to share the Bible here. Okay, so Revelation 15 and verse 1 is where we go now. All right. After this is after John has seen the harvesting of the earth. He says, I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels having the 7 last plagues, for in them is filled up the wrath of God. So the point I want to make here is that this takes place immediately after we see the harvest. Jesus with a sickle, he harvests the wheat, and another angel with a sharp sickle, he harvests the grapes, and he pours them into the winepress of the wrath of God. And then now John sees 7 angels having the 7 last plagues. So what we can see is that the Bible is taking us through a sequence. Revelation is taking us through a sequence. So you can see clearly, you have the mark of the beast crisis, then you have the 3 angels' messages, then you have the harvest, then you have the plagues. So the plagues do not take place until after the harvest. You remember Jesus says in many of his parables, but in this one in particular, he talks about the wheat and the tares growing together till the harvest. And he will say, in the time of the harvest, he will say, gather first the wheat into my barn, but gather the tares in bundles for the burning, and then you gather the wheat into the barn. And then it says, there shall be weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth. And if you say, when is this weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth? It's after the harvest, when the wrath of God is poured out. So there's a harvest. The harvest is not when we are gathered up to heaven or we are taken into paradise. The harvest is when the judgment is over and the people are separated into these 2 classes. When the 2 classes become very clearly distinct, then God's people are sealed forever. This is the harvest. And when those who reject God are sealed forever with the mark, this is the harvest. So the harvest is the complete establishment, the solidifying of the hearts and minds of people, so that everybody is clearly set where he belongs. This is the harvest. And so after this harvest, then there's the plagues. Now, it says that in these plagues there is filled up the wrath of God. We emphasize this, and I want to repeat it. I believe more and more that this wrath of God refers to God's separation from people, God's complete separation. When you think about the wrath of God, it's mentioned in Romans chapter 1, where it says the wrath of God is revealed from heaven. And it talks about, because when they knew God, they glorified him not as God. Therefore, God gave them up, the wrath of God. When we look at Jesus on the cross, Jesus suffered the wrath of God. What did God do to Jesus? Did God drive nails in his hand? Did God whip him with a cat o' nine tails? Did God torture him? God never did any of these things. What God did was God gave him up. God gave him up. God abandoned Jesus. This was the wrath of God. Jesus suffered what we should have suffered. What should God have done for those that he loves who turn their back and reject God? He leaves them alone. He leaves them to their freedom. And the worst thing God can do to anybody is to leave you alone. That's the worst thing God can do. Those of us who have come by the hard road to Christianity, this is one of the blessings of what we learned. Those who came by the hard road, because not everybody came by that hard road, but those who came by the hard road. I know you became a Christian because you felt the pain in your heart. You felt the longing in your heart. You wanted something, and sometimes you didn't know what it was, but you felt that longing for fellowship with God. And you never felt that peace until that reconciliation took place. The wrath of God is that complete separation which we never experienced. We just had a little bit of it. But when it happens completely, it says that this is a this experience is filled up completely to the brim. The fullness of what it means to be separated from God is to be experienced by the world after the harvest. And this experience are the consequences, let me say, the consequences of this wrath of God, this separation from God, will be the seven last plagues. So when God leaves the world, what happens? Well, for generations, people have been looking for a World War III. When I was much younger, I thought maybe there'll be a third world war with atomic weapons. And you know, we have always said that for the first time in the history of the planet, man has the power to literally destroy the world, because there was enough stockpiling of atomic weapons between the Soviet Union and the United States that had the capacity to wipe out humanity. And I suppose they still have those weapons stockpiled, because I understand you can't just destroy them like that, atomic weapons. But anyway, we have never seen man's foolishness and man's wickedness fully on display, with Satan fully in control. It has never happened. Grace has always restrained the full consequences of man's enmity to God. Grace has always restrained it, but not here. Not here, because it says God's wrath is filled up. God's wrath is filled up. And the result will be these seven last plagues. Okay? Now, what happens when we see this? The question that you have in your mind, and the question that comes naturally to people's mind, is what about God's people? If something so terrible is coming up on the earth, where are God's people? What about God's people? Now, let me just take us back a little bit in time and show you something and remind you of something. Remember that every time this comes up, every time this question comes up, God answers it. Go back to Revelation chapter 6 and look at the last verse. Revelation 6 and the last verse. Look at what it says. It says, "For the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand?" Remember when we were going through this, we saw that the sixth seal sounded, and there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, the moon became as blood, the stars of heaven fell, and so on. And it says the great men and the kings and so on, they ran to the rocks and mountains, and they said, "Fall on us and hide us from the face of him that sits on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of his wrath has come, and who shall be able to stand?" And what does God do? Immediately, as soon as you see this, what does God do? Immediately, chapter 7, the next chapter, he shows you what? The sealing of the 144,000. He shows you another angel coming from the east, having the seal of the living God. And he says, "Do not hurt the earth, nor the sea, nor the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God in their foreheads." So immediately God shows you the crisis. God shows you the end of grace, and he shows you that his people are protected. They are safe. Where do we see this again? Again, we go to Revelation 13. And what's the last thing we see? We see that he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or their foreheads. He causes that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. Nobody can buy or sell, they are to be killed. Where are God's people? The question comes to your mind again. What about God's people? How do they survive? What do we see in the next chapter? Immediately when we go to the next chapter, I looked, and lo, a lamb stood on the Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having its father's name written in their foreheads. Every time the crisis comes up, every time it mentions the crisis or the wrath of God, God shows us the 144,000. We come again to Revelation, the end of Revelation 14. And what do we see? We see The harvest is over. The harvest is finished, and the winepress was trodden without the city, and blood came out of the winepress even unto the horses' bridles. Where are God's people? How do they survive when these vines are thrown into the wrath of God, into the great winepress of the wrath of God? What does God do? Chapter 15, immediately I saw, verse 2, Revelation 15:2. I saw as it were a sea of glass mingled with fire, and them that had gotten the victory over the beast and over his image and over his mark and over the number of his name stand on the sea of glass, having the harps of God. So I hope you get the point that I'm trying to make. What I'm trying to say is that every single time in Revelation you come upon a place where there seems to be a tremendous crisis taking place on earth, more than a crisis, when it comes to the place, to a great moment when it seems like there is no hope for anybody on the planet. The crisis has become so acute. It seems there's no hope. Everybody is to be wiped out or destroyed or to suffer great, devastating, great devastation. Every time God shows you the 144,000, they are the ones that will survive. They will be preserved by God. They will be victorious over this situation. So it says in verse 3, and they sing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying, Great and marvelous are thy works, Lord God Almighty. Just and true are thy ways, thou King of saints. Let me read the next verse as well. Who shall not fear thee, O Lord, and glorify thy name? For thou only art holy. For all nations shall come and worship before thee, for thy judgments are made manifest. So, the Song of Moses. The Song of Moses. What is the Song of Moses? I don't recall Moses himself singing a song in the Bible, but what I recall is his sister Miriam singing a song. And the song that Miriam composed, it's there in Exodus. It's after they came out of Egypt, and when the Egyptian soldiers were destroyed in the Red Sea, Miriam sang a song of deliverance and victory. Now it says the 144,000, they are singing the song of Moses. And what does that imply? A little earlier on in chapter 14? Yes, at the beginning of chapter 14, we saw where the 144,000 were singing. The 144,000 were singing a song. They were playing the harps of God, and they were singing a song. And we in verse 3 it says, and they sung as it were a new song. And we made the point that a song is an expression of your experience. So the 144,000 are singing of their experience. Here in chapter 15, it says they are singing the song of Moses, the servant of God. And what it suggests is that the experience of these people is similar to the experience of Moses. So right away you think of, what was it that Moses experienced? Moses' experience was something that none of his people ever experienced, and it was deliverance from Egypt. Moses was delivered from Egypt. Moses became the person who led the children of Israel out of Egypt, and they had an experience like nobody else ever had before. It's a new song, it's a new experience. So the Bible says that these people, the 144,000, they are singing the song of Moses, the servant of God. So first of all, it's a song of deliverance from Egypt. And you can understand, because what the world is experiencing now, it may be Sodom, but in one experience, in one perspective, it is also Egypt, because Egypt was a place where God's people were locked in and they were not permitted to be free, and where the ruler of Egypt had no respect for God. The ruler of Egypt said, who is the Lord God that I should obey his voice? I know not the Lord, neither will I obey his voice. So God's people are delivered out of this kind of situation. It's a song of Moses Because even though it's another kind of Egypt and it's another kind of deliverance, it's also deliverance from the land of sin. Egypt represented sin, the dominion of sin. And the Exodus was the escape from sin, deliverance from sin. So these people have finally been completely and irrevocably, once and for all, completely set free from sin. So they are singing the song of Moses, the servant of God. But they are also singing the song of the Lamb. And what is the song of the Lamb? If you were to pick a moment in the life of Jesus that he would make a song about, which moment would you choose? And I would say I would probably think that it was when he was on the cross, because the cross was the moment when all of Jesus' experiences came to a climax. The cross was the place where the whole purpose of his life came to a climax. On the cross, Jesus went through his new experience. On the cross, Jesus went through an experience that even God had never experienced. Nobody ever experienced what Jesus went through. He is the only person who ever experienced this kind of test where God separated himself from him. Up to that point, nobody had ever experienced this. So this is the song of Jesus. He went through that experience and yet he conquered sin. He completely overcame sin. This is the song of Jesus. So I understand from this that the 144,000 also goes through an experience where they completely overcome sin. And yet it is through an experience of great trial where it seems like they have no hope. But they go through the experience and they are victorious. So it is in some respects similar to the experience of Christ. So it is said to be the experience of the Lamb. And what are they singing? They are saying, "Great and marvelous are thy works, Lord God Almighty. Just and true are thy ways, thou King of saints." Everything has a meaning, right? What they are saying is that what we're about to see is an aspect of God's character that we have never seen before. The only place we ever saw it was on the cross when God separated from Jesus. Nobody has ever seen God completely abandon a planet. And so, you have the question, how can God do this? Can this be right? Can it be right for the people that God created and for the people that he loved, for God to abandon them completely? But the 144,000 says, your ways are just and true. They are exalting the rightness of God or the righteousness of God. They are saying your ways are just and true. They have passed through this crisis and they have seen everything that is involved. And so they are the ones who are qualified to say, is it fair for God to behave this way? They have seen the behavior of people. They have seen how people respond to God's grace and God's goodness. And so they are testifying, your ways are just and true. Your ways are right, you King of saints, Lord God Almighty, because even though you're turning your back on these people and you're abandoning them forever, you are just and true in what you're doing. So there's a message there. It's not just a poetic line in the book of Revelation. It's a statement of what these people have learned in their experience. It's a statement to those people who will say, God will do this or God will not do this or it doesn't seem right. This is a statement to those people to say that when God does this, it's the right thing to do. It's the only thing that he could do under the circumstances. Notice what it says again in the next verse. Who shall not fear thee, O Lord, and glorify thy name? All nations shall come and worship before thee, for thy judgments are made manifest. Is this true? Will the nations at this point worship God? I don't think so. I don't think the beast kingdom is going to worship God. I don't think the people who have received the mark of the beast are going to worship God. So this is an anticipatory statement. The 144,000 are speaking of what will be the consequence of this moment that we have come to. What will be the consequence? The consequence will be that all nations shall come and worship God. Again, you can see this demonstrates that this is the final point in time. This demonstrates that this is the end of grace. It's what we call the close of probation, because from this point, after this event, all nations will come and worship God. Everybody will fear his name. Everybody will glorify his name. The last enemies of God are cut off at this moment. So just in case anybody has any question about whether or not this is really the close of probation, the end of grace, this statement also implies as much. From this point on, all who remain will glorify his name. From this point on, the nations will come and worship God. Because his judgment, and the word judgment here, we often think of it in terms of a judicial sentence, but it also implies his ways of dealing with controversial issues. Your judgment, in other words, his decisions. So a person's judgment is not necessarily just in the context of a courtroom. It's also in the sense of the decisions you made. I've made a judgment on this matter. I've come to this decision. So God's decisions and the justice of his decisions are revealed. So the 7 last plagues, they are not just arbitrary events. God doesn't just allow 7 plagues, a moment of suffering for the unrepentant. Just like when Noah went into the ark, the door was shut, and yet the flood never came. There were 7 days. And in those 7 days, I think the same thing happened. God's judgments were made manifest. Was God justified in closing the door? Because you know what happened? I bet you when the rain started, they came knocking on the door. I bet they came beating down the door and asking to be let in. Was God just and fair in keeping the door closed? Those 7 days made his judgment manifest, because what happened was that in those 7 days, nobody repented. They saw the animals going into the ark. They saw the door of the ark shut. For 7 days, nobody changed his mind. Nobody asked to be let in. Nobody repented. Those 7 days demonstrated that God's decision in shutting the door was perfectly justified. And I believe it's the same thing here. In these 7 last plagues, will anybody repent? Absolutely not. If you go back to Revelation 8 and Revelation 9, you will see that they blasphemed the God of heaven because of their sores, but they did not repent. So God's judgments make it clear. What happens makes it clear that God is just and true in what he does. In verse 5, it says, "And after that I looked, and behold, the temple of the tabernacle of the testimony in heaven was opened." Now, last week we made a point about this and didn't dwell on it too much, but the point is, when we talk about heaven, I think if we give it a lot of thought, we will have to think that we are a little bit uncertain as to what heaven will really look like. Maybe not a little bit, maybe a lot uncertain. I remember the stages I morphed through as a little boy. I thought of heaven as a place where we would kind of float around on clouds. Maybe I watched too much cartoons or whatever. That was my concept as a little boy. But always heaven was like a big open place where there was God sitting somewhere in the middle, and all of us kind of drifting around the area, floating or flying or what. I didn't have any clearly defined ideas of what heaven was like. Later on, maybe through reading the writings of Ellen White a lot, I developed a concept of a place with golden streets and buildings and my own little corner in heaven, and getting up and going out and visit my brethren, but in a place where there's some kind of city where God is living there, and we fly or we walk and we go and visit the city where he is. And vague ideas, but it was mingled with some of the pictures from Revelation. Here, Revelation talks about the temple in heaven. In reading through Revelation, if you start from chapter 1 and you start coming through, you see that in many places it talks about the temple is open in heaven. Revelation 11, and the last verse, it says, the temple was open in heaven, and they were seen in the temple the ark of the testament. And over it talks about the voice coming out of the temple, or an angel coming out of the temple, like in this case. So there's a place, when you look at Revelation, there's a place in heaven called the temple. But you have to ask yourself the question now, is this intended to be a literal description of a literal place? That's a legitimate question, because the same Revelation tells you that there's an altar in heaven and that there are souls under the altar. So if it's a real altar, are there real souls under the altar? And if there's a real altar in heaven, what's the purpose of the altar? Because the altar is for burning incense. There's supposed to be a fire on the altar, and incense is being burned. And you say, okay, and there's a censer, because there's an angel in Revelation who has a censer that he's offering up incense and the prayers of the saints. So after giving it a little thought, you are compelled to conclude that some of these things are symbolic. And if some are symbolic, where do you draw the line and say this is literal and this is symbolic? Because if the censer is symbolic, doesn't it mean the altar is symbolic? If the souls under the altar are symbolic, doesn't it mean the altar is symbolic? And if the altar is symbolic, doesn't it mean the temple is symbolic? You can see where, if you take a chain of reasoning, you can see where it takes you. In my own mind, I take this position. I don't know if there's a literal temple in heaven, but in the book of Revelation, I believe that the temple being spoken of is a symbolic place. All right, that is my.
Can I ask? Can I ask something here, please? In 21, chapter 21 and 22, it says, "I saw no temple therein, for the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are the temple of it." So it seems one place it's telling you there's a temple, and then the other place it's saying there is no temple. So it's interesting what you're saying, that it's symbolic, because, is there or isn't there a temple?
Thank you, Brother Allen. That's a very good point, and I appreciate it, because there it tells you that Christ and God are the temple. And it brings me to the question that the next point I'm going to make, which is relevant to what we have been saying here. But I just want to make the point, because a lot of the times you find that brethren get into an argument and they get into a conflict over a literal or a figurative temple. And I think there are some arguments that are pointless, because the thing is, if there's a literal temple, I don't know how it affects my Christian experience today. What I'm interested in is, when God presents the temple as a figurative place, what is his point? What is his point? I want that lesson, because that lesson is going to affect my Christian experience. That's what I'm interested in. But it's like when I go to heaven, will the street be made of gold? How does that affect me? Will the gates be made of jasper? Maybe. But what if it's made of pearl or obsidian? What does that matter? It doesn't affect me at all. Those are just matters of curiosity. But when God presents it as a figurative thing, I think he's trying to say something that might affect my experience today, which is why I want to understand the meaning of the symbol. Now, so I'm making the point that the temple that we are seeing here in heaven, I believe it represents something, and I'm asking, what does it represent? Well, here's my thought. In verse 6, look at verse 6. It says, "And the 7 angels came out of the temple, having the 7 plagues, clothed in pure and white linen, and having their breasts girded with golden girdles." Again, I want to emphasize, everything that you see in the book of Revelation, every detail is placed there by a divine mind, by the mind of God. So every word is probably filled with meaning. So you can't overlook anything because everything has a message. You know, it's not just like David Clayton is trying to say something and he composes a sentence. In my sentence, there can be words that are imprecise, or maybe I put in an extra word as an added adjective. But if God composes something, we had better be careful to treat it with more respect than that. So,
Brother
as I
David,
look at,
can I emphasize on something there, please?
go ahead, Brother Ray.
Yeah,
Testing, testing.
it's just a thought that this temple here, the way that I'm looking at it, it's just as an emphasis is a place where there is a lot of activity. It's like if I go to your house, there's a lot of activities with your kids, your wife, family, whatever. So it's a place where God is at, where there's a lot of activity going on, where there's angels there and whatever's going on there. But for me, I mean, it's a little place because it's a place where there's activity going on. So the temple to me simply means a place where everybody's gathering together and the movement is going on.
All right. Thank you, Brother Ray. But I'm going to say something that may be a little contrary to what you just said, because actually, I want to remind us of something. John is in heaven, but he's not in the temple. Remember that. So when he goes to heaven, he sees God sitting on the throne. Is God in the temple? No, he's not in the temple. Jesus is standing before the throne. He's a lamb that was slain. Is he in the temple? He's not in the temple. The four living creatures are around the throne. This is on a sea of glass. It is not in the temple. So if you read through coming from chapter 4 right up, you find that John is seeing things happen in heaven. Then apparently there is another place called the temple. So John says 7 angels come out of the temple. Come out where? They come out into the open space, where the sea of glass is, where John is standing, where the four living creatures are standing. It's different from the temple. That's why I'm making this point. So the temple is represented as a separate place in heaven. That's the point I'm making. I'm going to explain why. My
I
thought
agree.
on it. If you look at
David,
what,
I want to make a point before you move on, if you don't
okay,
mind.
go ahead. Go ahead. Ian.
Well, the brother Warren has, I think, made a point about saying that John saw that there was no temple because Christ and God was the temple. I think chapter 21 onwards towards the end is less symbolic and more realistic based on the things that are said there about no more tears and all of those good things that John the angel told John. So I think from chapter 21 back towards the end, it's more realistic of what is really seen, and that's where it speaks about the New Jerusalem and the city and stuff like that.
Okay. All right. So the fact that there's no temple might be an expression of the way things literally are, you're saying. Okay, fine. Now, I want to make this point about the temple. And I think it's an important point because when you look at it from this perspective, we can pick up quite a few things, important things. I believe that the temple, we misunderstand the purpose of the temple. If you go into many Adventist churches, well, I've seen it in many of them, and I know it says Seventh-day Adventist Temple. Maybe some of them will say, reverence my sanctuary. There's usually in all of them at the back of a big sign that says, reverence my sanctuary. And in many places, I've seen Seventh-day Adventist Temple. I know also that this is true for other denominations. I think Mormons especially have something they call the temple, and other churches refer to the sanctuary. Okay, so the concept is ingrained in the popular psyche. The concept is embedded that the sanctuary or the temple is a place of worship. I want to adjust our thinking a little bit. When I look at it and when I look at all the things that are said about the temple, it's not so much a place of worship. The Jews in the Old Testament, they gathered around the sanctuary for their worship, but they didn't actually worship in the sanctuary, but they gathered around the sanctuary. And it is true that their thoughts were focused on the sanctuary where God was dwelling. But at the same time, what is the point of the sanctuary? I'm going to suggest something to you. The sanctuary is the center of the plan of salvation. The sanctuary is what you would call the command center of the plan of salvation. It's kind of suggested in the book of Psalms, where I think it's Psalm 77, where David says, "Thy way, O God, is in the sanctuary." In other words, the sanctuary is it's like when humanity fell into sin, God established a command post, or it's like he built a room. Let me use a physical illustration. He built a room and he says everything that relates to the salvation of man is going to take place in this room. Let us say, for example, the rest of heaven carried on its normal business, but the salvation of humanity, the plan of salvation, is located in this place that is called the sanctuary or the temple. Now, again, remember, I'm suggesting that it is not necessarily a literal temple, but what I'm talking about is the concepts surrounding the plan of salvation. They were represented in this earthly temple. Let me suggest to you that every major event in the plan of salvation centers around the sanctuary. Now, bear this in mind, and you are going to see something significant here, right? At this point, 7 angels come out of the temple having the 7 plagues. Now, I wondered, why did the angels come out of the temple having plagues? Because plagues are terrible things. They are negative. You might even say that they are evil things. And yet the temple is supposed to be a good place. Why do the angels come out of the temple? Now, let me just see if anybody can kind of pick up what I'm trying to say here. One person only, the first person. What would you see as a suggestion here in light of what I just said? Anybody? 1, 2.
How can something bad come out of a place where everything is good?
Right.
I think it's the fact that I think you made a point earlier when you were speaking about God, the wrath of God being pulled in His presence. I think it's a sign that the salvation aspect of things is come to an end.
That's what I'm trying to say, Brother Ian. So thank you. Right. So these 7 angels, remember, we started out by saying these are not necessarily angels. The activities of God are represented as angels, whether it is God's people carrying a message or something that God is doing. What does God do in this case? God cuts off his communication with the earth. God cuts off, the plan of salvation comes to an end. What then does this have to do with the sanctuary? What it means is that in the temple of God, the place of grace is ended. So what comes from the sanctuary at this point? No blessing, no blessing. And this is something righteous, because the 144,000 have just said, righteous are thy ways, just and true. So this is righteousness. So the angels are represented as having pure white linen. And yet what is coming from the sanctuary is not a message of grace and blessing. It's a message of devastation, because what it is the message that God's grace has ended. Let me pause a little to make sure that you understand, because if it does not make sense, let me go back over it. It's not a major point, but I find it a little, I'm kind of focused on it, because this is a question I've had in my mind for a long time. You know, why are these angels represented as coming out of the temple? Why is it that so much is happening coming out of the temple? And this understanding is something that is kind of new to my mind. So I'm kind of hoping that what I'm saying makes sense. It's raining and I need to close my window, so just give me a second.
So the angels that are coming out of the temple, Brother David, are clothed in pure and white linen and having their breasts girded with golden girdles. Do you think that is significant too?
The golden girdles, I
White,
believe have some significance, but I'm not going to comment on it because I don't have a thought on what it represents. I know Jesus represented in Revelation 1 as having a golden girdle, and he's dressed in white linen. I know that that Michael standing on the water in Daniel 10 is dressed similarly. The heavenly beings are Jesus is often represented as having white linen and a golden girdle. So I believe the
um,
golden girdle might it means something because Jesus says it to Laodicea, I counsel thee to buy of me gold tried in the fire and white raiment that thou mayest be clothed. So there's some connection there. But
I,
exactly what
I
the goal.
have a thought. I have a thought on that. Earlier you read about the 144,000 saying that God is worthy and just regarding the seven last plagues. Would the white linen and the golden girdle here represent the angels or represents the priestly? In other words, saying that they are just in whatever they're doing. These messengers or these angels are pure and righteous, and therefore whatever they are doing is representative of the righteousness of God, allowing this to happen, just like the 144,000 was singing before.
Yes, that their mission is worthy and it is just. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Now I understand what we are doing here is we are trying to look at physical, visible representations, and we are trying to give it an invisible spiritual application. Because we are saying it's not literal seven angels, it's not literal seven bowls, it's not literal white garment and golden girdles. We are trying to look at what these symbolize instead of actually saying that there are seven angels leaving a room in heaven. And
so Brother David, are you saying they're not literal plagues, or
no,
they just represent a cutoff point, or like, could you make maybe a parallel between Egypt and the last plagues, the state of Egypt, God's relationship with Egypt being severed completely, with the parallel of the world being severed from God's grace? Can you make that parallel? And it's not necessarily literally seven plagues, but just the cutoff point, maybe.
what I will say is that in Egypt, I believe that the plagues, of course, they were literal.
Yes.
The difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament is often that you see a literal event in the Old Testament and you see a New Testament parallel that is not literal, it has more a symbolic or spiritual meaning. Like, for example, Elijah in the Old Testament was a single individual. Elijah in the end of time is more the spirit that comes upon God's people. It's not one person named Elijah. It's the spirit of Elijah. In the same way, the plagues, the seven plagues of Egypt were literal, the 10 plagues. Whereas the seven plagues, the seven plagues at the end of time might be, as brother Alan is saying, brother Warren is saying, it might be that we are looking at seven as a figurative number. Anyway, when we come to chapter 16, I think we will look more closely at that because you have a very detailed description in chapter 16, so we can look more closely at that. But what I'm saying at this point is that the seven plagues are consequences. They are consequences because normally there was a time in my life when I would have considered somebody like myself. What I'm saying now, I would have considered me as an apostate because I was determined that the seven last plagues are God actively punishing the world. Whereas at this moment, I would think that it is God withdrawing his protection and the forces of evil human nature combined with satanic wickedness bring these devastating events upon the world. Even though in Revelation it is represented that the angel pours out his vial each time. There's a part in many of us that would say God is giving them what they deserve, and they're saying God is torturing them, because you have to call it torture. God is torturing them because they have been so evil. But I don't think like that anymore. I think God's wrath, the worst thing that God has done is to leave them alone. And I think the 7 plagues are the consequences of the
I agree,
choices.
brother. I never liked when Ellen White would, in some of her writings, she would say they were being punished for their sins and their iniquities, and use it a few times. And I never, jived with that interpretation of punishment.
Yes. And we know that this is not to say God does not inflict pain, as we discussed this morning, that he does not do it. But when God does it, it is always for the sake of redemption or for the sake of rehabilitation. There's even a verse that says he does not needlessly afflict nor bruise the children of men. When God bruises you and afflicts you, it's because he's looking for something good to come out of you, or he's trying to put an end to pain and suffering. He does not torture people. That's not the spirit of God. So anyway, but it happens. These people are going to be tortured, but it is not the doing of God. It is they are eating the fruit of the choice they have made. So it's but the Bible represents it in this positive way by saying the 7 angels come out. So God's messengers that leave the temple is the message of the end of grace. And it is righteous. So they are represented as righteous angels. And the detail is very graphic, because it says in verse 7, and one of the 4 beasts gave unto the 7 angels 7 golden vials full of the wrath of God, who liveth forever and ever. God is sovereign. Okay, what happens here? What is represented here is represented as God actively doing something. And just to point out this before I go to that. Notice the angels come out of the temple, and what do they meet? They meet upon the 4 beasts, the 4 living creatures. And they give the 7 angels the 7 golden vials full of the wrath of God, who lives forever and ever. So it just reinforces the point that the temple is not where the throne of God is. And the temple is not where these 4 living creatures are, because the angels come out of the temple, then they are given the bowls by the 4 beasts who are on the outside. So it's just emphasizing the point that what we are seeing here is a carefully designed parable. And God puts together the elements in a very literal way, and it's up to us as we read the book to figure out what is the spiritual implication of this. So,
Brother David, I notice here that in verse 6 it says that the 7 angels came out of the temple having the 7 plagues. But in verse 7 it says that it's one of the 4 beasts that gave them the 7 vials,
right.
which has the wrath of God in it. Which is, so is there a difference between the wrath of God and the vials and the plagues?
Well, I can only look at what is written here, right?
I just
And
noticed that.
I would suggest that John is suggesting that the plagues are different from the vials. The vials carry the plagues, but what is the connection between them? I can only look at what is written here, and it seems like, yeah, they are represented as being slightly different, but of course overlapping. I don't know if it matters really, because it's when you pour out the vial that the plague takes place. But maybe in how it is presented to him, it's presented like one is a little different from the other. That's all I can say. I'm going to go to verse 8, because verse 8 is probably the verse on which we will close this evening. But verse 8 is important. It's another important element in the whole scenario. It says in verse 8, and the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power. And no man was able to enter into the temple till the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were fulfilled. Now, this event has happened at least 2 times before, or a similar event. Let me go to Exodus 40, verses 33 and 35. And here's the first time that I recall seeing this in the Bible. It's when Moses finished building the temple. It says, and he reared up the court round about the tabernacle and the altar. And in Exodus 40 and verse 33. And set up the hanging of the court gate. So Moses finished the work. Then a cloud covered the tent of the congregation, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter into the tent of the congregation because the cloud abode thereon, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Now, is there a connection between what we are reading here in Revelation and what we are seeing here in Exodus? Remember, I believe that when you see a clear similarity between two passages from the Revelation and from the Old Testament, God is saying, look at what it means. So in Exodus, what we see is that when the temple was finished, the place that was the center of salvation, when it was completed, God's glory filled it and nobody could enter the temple. Something, I'm sorry, I'm at the wrong place. It switched back. All right. Yeah. Right. Back here in Exodus. Right. So nobody could go into the temple because the glory of the Lord had filled it. Moses was not able to enter. He was the only one who could enter, but he could not enter. When it says in Revelation here, on the left-hand panel, no man was able to enter into the temple. Just give me an idea, somebody. Who do you think this is referring to?
Jesus.
Christ.
I think I agree with you. Yes, Christ. Because Jesus is a high priest. And the place of the high priest is in the temple. So this is God's way of showing us in the book of Revelation, again reinforcing the point that this is the end of grace. Jesus has finished his work in the temple. Nobody can enter the temple till the 7 plagues of the 7 angels are fulfilled. It says the temple is filled with smoke from the glory of God. Now this is a heavenly temple, which as we are seeing is a representative place. It's representation of the plan of salvation. But what it means is that the plan of salvation is ended. The true temple, God's people in Jesus, they are filled with the glory of God. But when you relate that to the place of salvation in heaven, it means that there's no more work of salvation. Nobody is able to enter the temple until these 7 plagues are fulfilled. So again, that's another reinforcement that says we have come to the end of the plan of salvation as far as man is concerned. Also in 1 Kings chapter 8, 1 Kings chapter 8, this is the second temple. You remember the first one was made out of animal skins, and then Solomon built one out of gold and precious materials and stones, and then he finished the temple. And it says, when the temple was dedicated, it came to pass when the priests were come out of the holy place that the cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord had filled the house of the Lord. So it's the same thing that happens here in Revelation. And what we see is that at the time of the 7 last plagues, not only is the work of salvation finished, but the temple of God, which is God's people, at this point, the 144,000, are filled with the glory of God. And because they are filled with the glory of God, nobody is ministering in the heavenly temple because the work of salvation is over. Instead of God working in the temple in heaven, God has finished his work in the temple of their hearts. And so there's no longer any minister in that heavenly scheme of salvation. So this is what I see in this chapter 15 here. And next week, we're going to go
Amen,
straight.
Brother David, for that point. Amen.
Thank you, Sister Anita. So next week, we're going to go straight to chapter 16, where we will spend some time looking at the plagues themselves, and then probably we can gain some insight on Brother Warren's question relating to the difference between the plagues of Egypt and the 7 last plagues. Now, I'm not going to close off. We're a little bit early in finishing this evening. it's 10 to 5, and we usually carry on till a little after 5. But I don't want to start chapter 16 until we can actually go through everything together. So what I'm going to do is ask if there are any questions or comments. We can have a little time for that now, maybe another 15 minutes or so. But I'm going to ask us to please, I shouldn't have to say this, brothers and sisters, but I have to say, if I have to say it, I'm going to say it. I'm going to ask us to be orderly and to be tolerant and to be courteous to each other. All right? Please. Yes, Brother Matt, please go ahead.
Is that for orderly? Well, my question was more toward the beginning of the chapter in regard to the image, the number of and those three things, those three aspects that are talked about as receiving from the second beast. Are those separate? I think you mentioned that you thought that they were separate, or that they were all one. They were kind of like linked to each other. It's obvious to me that they are, but if they're separate things.
Let me go back to the actual passage, because yes, we did comment on it, and it's Revelation chapter 13, and in Revelation 13, near the end, it says, in verse 17, what we looked at was the way it is expressed in the NASB, and in other versions it says, he that had the mark, which is either the name of the beast or the number of his name. In other words, it suggests, let me look at the NIV, which kind of expresses it a little better, a little more clearly. It says, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name, or in addition, the number of its name. So the idea we have here is that the mark of the beast is the same as the name of the beast. And in addition, there is a number associated with that name. So it's actually two things I see when I look at this from this perspective. And you might ask the question, why would I accept the NIV and the NASB over the King James Version? And the reason is because the King James Version itself agrees with it in chapter 14. If you go to chapter 14 in the King James Version, and you look at the third angel's message, it says, it's not chapter 13, it's not chapter 14, it might be chapter 15. It might be chapter 15. Let me see if it's chapter 15. I think it's chapter 15 in verse 2. We just read it this evening, by the way. And Brother Matt said it came up at the beginning. Yes, it says in verse 2, them that had gotten the victory over. Look at what it says. The beast, his image, his mark, and the number of his name. It mentions the mark and the number of his name. It mentions two things. It mentions the mark and the number associated with his name. So if you go back to that chapter, if you go back to chapter 13, it agrees, because in chapter 13 it says, he that had the mark, which is the name, or in addition to that, you could have the number of his name. So there are two ways you can be marked. You can have the mark, which is the name, or you can have the number associated with the name. So there's a name and the number of the name. Those are the two things that I see. So the question would be, what is the number of the name? And it goes back to the way we were looking at this number. We suggested that a number signifies the the spiritual value, the spiritual value, like the number 666 or the number 144,000 or the number 7. It carries an evaluation, a spiritual evaluation. So the spiritual evaluation of the name of the beast. So if you have the name of the beast is blasphemy. So you might be a blasphemer, an open blasphemer. And the mark is something that is tied to this blasphemy. Or maybe you don't have the mark itself, but you have the spiritual principle that is associated with the name. We can discuss that a little more because I know it sounds a little bit vague. But what I'm thinking of is that the world, there are many people in the world who may not actually be practicing the mark of the beast, whatever it is, but they have the same kind of philosophical outlook. They have the same kind of approach to God. They think like this. They hold the same values and they see things in the same way. And to me, these people would have the number, they would have the spiritual value of the name of the beast, even though they may not actually have the mark itself, in the sense that they don't actually practice what the mark is. It's kind of like you have the mark in your hand or in the forehead, something similar. So that's my thought on it, Brother Matt.
Okay, and so the multitudes are deceived into receiving this.
Well, deceived is a technical word because they are deceived, but there's a verse. I want to explain this because if a person is honestly deceived, God will be merciful to that person. But if we go back to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, God says, because they receive not the love of the truth that they should be saved, for this cause God shall send them strong delusion that they shall believe a lie. So they believe the lie, they are deceived. But the reason why this happens is because, first of all, they rejected the truth. So the time will come, Jesus says, when a person will kill you and honestly think that he's doing God's service. And you might say, is not that person an honest person? Is he not genuinely deceived? Yes, because first of all, he closed his eyes to God's truth. So God abandoned him. And so he comes to believe the lie. He really believes the lie is true, but he's not without accountability because first of all, he rejected the truth.
Thank you.
I appreciate the questions, Brother Matt. So I see Brother Ian attempting to talk, but his mic is muted.
Yeah, I clicked on the wrong thing here. Yeah, what about the Romans chapter when it said that they have not the love of the truth? So it's not only that they reject the truth, or some truth might come to them previously, but they reject it because they don't love the truth. And so therefore, when other truth or more important truth come, they don't believe it and they believe a lie rather. What do you think about that?
Yes, it's true because the rejection of truth is not usually something that happens in an instant. God does not treat people in that way. He doesn't turn away from people just because you have heard something one time. It's a progressive thing that takes place in increments. People don't just get up and reject God. You start with little half truth that you believe, little rejections of God here and there, and you begin to build up a wall that begins to increase and grow until the time comes when you actually think you are standing on solid ground, when you are very far from God because it didn't happen overnight. This is where deception takes place. You are self-deceived, or you are deceived by the devil by degrees. When Jesus spoke about it, he talked about people who were caught by the deceitfulness of riches, the cares of this life, the deceitfulness of riches. He mentioned a few things there. And he implied, when he talks about the deceitfulness of riches, he was implying that people don't just fall into deception overnight. It's that they allow things into their lives that creep upon them and gradually overwhelm what is good until they come to the place where they no longer have the capability of discerning what is true. So, yeah, I agree with that. So, if there is any other question, we might be able to take one more, and if not, then I will appreciate and thank you all for your participation this evening. And
I have a
officially,
question.
yes, Brother Ayayi, go ahead.
Brother David, everywhere in Revelation, when God talks about angel, does it mean human agent, or are there some places in Revelation that they are heavenly agents?
Well, I think we all can agree that, for example, in Revelation chapter 4, when it talks about Revelation 5, where it says that I heard the voice of them, and there were 10,000 times 10,000 and thousands of thousands. I think we have to be sensible, and it's very clear that here we are seeing a description of heaven, and clearly these are referring to heavenly angels. So I suppose you can say it's one of the challenges of the book of Revelation. Where do we draw the line between the figurative and the literal? What rule do we apply in saying this is literal or this is figurative? And for myself, I will say I haven't been able to find a measuring implement by which I can say, look, this measures, so it has to be spiritual. This doesn't measure, so it has to be physical. I don't see one rule that can fit every place. In most cases, what I've seen is that if we examine the context very carefully, and we apply good reasoning, and of course, hopefully, above all else, directed by the Spirit of God, we can generally tell where it is speaking of a literal angel as opposed to where it probably is not. But as I think your question implies, we are still, to a great extent, dependent upon the context of what we are looking at. So I would say, in answer to your question, of course not. I would never say that every angel in Revelation is symbolic or figurative.
Okay. My second question is, well, in the beginning of the study, you talk about the fall of Babylon. And you said that certainly is not in 1884 or around that time. So would you place the fall of Babylon after the mark the mark of the beast is implemented and Babylon accept the mark, or where will you place the fall of Babylon?
That's what I believe, brother. I believe that first of all, I don't think 1844 is where it's a very Seventh-day Adventist thing. It's very Adventist, and Adventists believe that in 1844 Adventists became Israel and everybody else became Babylon. You know this. You're familiar with this. So if it's Adventist theology that says Babylon fell in 1844, around 18 in the 1880s anyway, shortly after the first angel's message. So what it means is that as I say, it's a very Adventist teaching, because what it means is that every other denomination became Babylon, and because every other denomination did not accept the judgment hour message, every other denomination was fallen. So this is Adventism, and that's where the concept of the fall of Babylon in 1844 came from. So you have to ask the question: do we embrace the elements of that teaching? For example, do we believe that the Adventist Church is Israel, is God's Israel today? I know that I believed this. I know I don't believe it anymore. I don't believe it anymore, because at that time I used to define Israel as those who keep the Sabbath. Today, Israel, I understand to be those who possess the Spirit of Christ. I can't define Israel as a denomination anymore. So my understanding of Babylon has changed. I've come to realize that the great danger to true Christianity is institutionalized religion. I find this to be the danger in all levels of human society, whether it is politics or religion or science. When men institutionalize something, it becomes corrupt and it breeds worms and it stinks. And anyway, institutionalized religion is the Babylon that is responsible for deceiving people, and it is the Babylon that is to fall, because that is what is going to receive the mark of the beast. So that's how I see it, brother Ayayi.
Okay, thank you. And the last one is today, it comes from what you just said. There are also people who believe that the United States is the glorious land, or kind of Israel. What do you think about
Well, according to the Bible, the United States is a two-horned beast that has two horns like a lamb and speaks like a dragon. So I have difficulty in reconciling that with the idea that the United States is a glorious land. In addition to this idea that the United States is a glorious land, I don't know why anybody would come to that conclusion, because the only place, the only land that God ever claimed was in the Old Covenant, and it was the land of Palestine, the land of Israel. To try to apply the same kind of favor to a nation in the New Testament is contrary to the New Testament principles. I would have to believe that God has reversed and gone back to the same principles of the Old Covenant if God were to see things in this way. I don't think you can look at any real estate in the time of the New Covenant and say that God regards it as a glorious land.
Brother Dave,
I think that is kind of like wishful thinking on the part of people.